Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. This year, we're looking at the beginning of the semi-quincentennial of American independence and the Revolutionary War. And I'm, like Ed said, I'm basically a military historian, but this particular talk I give is mostly about the political implications that led to the Revolutionary War. So we'll go through it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, but please wait to the end so you don't derail my train of thought or something like that, or I may answer it in one of the later slides. So has anybody heard of the phrase and know where it comes from for Britannia's glory and wealth? It comes from a song that was written by John Dickinson, the famous guy that wrote A Farmer from Pennsylvania during the Townsend Act crisis. And he wrote a song, put it to the tune of Hearts of Oak, which is the Royal Navy's anthem. And it's considered a patriotic song. He called it the Liberty Song. And you'll see it on a lot of recorded music as one of the songs of the Revolutionary War, but it predates the Revolutionary War. And that's what the talk is all about. We didn't just wake up one day on April 19th, 1775 and start a war. And I'm sure you all know that. So that's what basically I cover, the political and in some cases economic lead up to the Revolutionary War. And that's why I call it that. First, it's kind of interesting to go through how the colonies were set up politically. We all know 13 colonies. 9 of them were royal colonies, the governors appointed by the secretaries of state through a commission from the King of England. And 2 of them are proprietary colonies, Maryland being one and Pennsylvania being the other. And says, well, Glenn, that only adds up to 12. Where's the 13th? Anybody know? The original name of Delaware is the 3 lower counties on Delaware. So it was technically part of Pennsylvania. In fact, Pennsylvanians will say we declared independence twice in 1776. Once from the king and once from Pennsylvania. But regardless of whether it was a royal colony, a proprietary colony, or, well, take that back, there's one other, Connecticut. Connecticut was a corporate colony. But regardless of how they were set up, most of them followed the British model and mirrored the British government. The British Constitution, Britain didn't have a written constitution. Yeah, that's right. Their constitution was the king or monarchy, the lords temporal and spiritual, the House of Lords, and the Commons. So 3 houses. In Parliament, there are 2 houses. The upper house, of course, House of Lords. We always try to relate it to kind of like the Senate. It's the upper house. The lower house, the House of Commons, kind of like our House of Representatives, they're technically elected. And just like in our own government, laws that have to do with raising money have to start in the lower house, the House of Commons, or in the colonies, say in Virginia, the lower house in the General Assembly was the House of Burgesses. So tax bills, tax laws have to start in that lower house. And most of the colonies mirrored that British model. You can see some of the pictures that I have. To the right of King George III is a painting, and it's supposed to be the House of Lords and Parliament. Under that is the House of Commons. Under that, I have 3 colonial capitals. Some of you might recognize them. The first one, of course, is the Old State House in Boston. And then on the bottom row, left to right, the Colony House in Newport, Rhode Island. The middle one is what the Virginia Capitol looked like in 1774, not the one they recreated that dates from earlier and burnt down. And on the right, barely visible, is the Pennsylvania State House, which we know as Independence Hall. And basically, the colonies were part of Great Britain, but had a somewhat semi-autonomous setup. Basically, it comes down to the colonies. Each one of them considered themselves a country, but British subjects nonetheless. The colonies basically joined to the mother country by mercantilism or trade and military alliance. Basically, well, I'll get to in the next slide, what they describe this system where the American colonies were kind of on their own for a long time. But that all changes in the French and Indian War, which ends in 1763, or the 7 Years' War, although it's longer than 7 years. This is some of the lyrics from the Liberty Song that John Dickinson wrote. Please don't ask me to sing. I was in the Latin Schola at my parish, and they said, your Latin is fine, but you can't carry a tune in a bucket. So, but look at these words. This bumper I crown for our sovereign's health. That means they're drinking to them, if you're unfamiliar with that term. And this for Britannia's glory and wealth, that wealth and that glory immortal be, if she is but just and we are but free. Does this sound like a song of rebellion? No. Does it sound like a song of revolution? No. This dates from, I think, 1768, and we'll get into that in a little while. So there were several constitutional crises along the way before we get to April 19th, 1775. As you can see, on the right-hand side, you see two images. One is the Virginia colony. The Virginia colony's original royal charter said from sea to sea. But practically speaking, you can see that it covers what are now not only Virginia and West Virginia, but Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And some people say also parts of Minnesota and Iowa. It doesn't mean that they owned it, okay? They still had to respect original occupancy, so they could only move in and settle once there was a treaty with the Indians that were occupying it before they could do that. But the term that's most often used to describe the relationship of the royal government and the 13 colonies is at the top there. It says salutary neglect. It's pretty much autonomy almost. Like I said, Britain only demanded loyalty and to be participants in trade through the system of mercantilism and a military alliance. And those first two, mercantilism and navigation acts, they kind of go together. Mercantilism means that the trade of the colonies is regulated and controlled by Great Britain. They could only trade with Great Britain and the colonies, British colonies in the West Indies or in the Caribbean, unless they have permission to trade with someone else. In fact, goods from, say, France had to be landed in Great Britain where they were taxed and then shipped to the colonies. And they had to be shipped on ships that flew the British flag. Again, British flag ships also included American colonial ships as well. So it had to go through that in order to be legal. And also the navigation acts we talk about, there are several. They kind of restricted the trade in certain commodities like sugar and trade with non-British colonies such as St. Eustatius, which was a Dutch colony in the Caribbean, or French colonies that were in the Caribbean as well. The 7 Years' War kind of changes everything. 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, ends with Great Britain being dominant in North America, and they pass, or the Parliament passes the Royal Proclamation, or the King issues his Royal Proclamation of 1763. Anybody heard of the Royal Proclamation? Or what it says? What does it say? Okay, good. Yes, sir.
No settlement west of the Shenandoah.
Okay, actually, it was a little more restrictive than that. From an arbitrary line drawn from the heads of the waters, which basically means the Appalachians that flow to the Mississippi. So anything beyond that line was reserved to the Indians as their hunting ground. So you're right, no settlement beyond that line. Anybody, you said you don't remember. It's kind of interesting read, okay? It says no settlement, but any further cessions of Indian land have to be executed as part of a treaty and by a representative of the crown. It didn't rule any further expansion out. And then the very next line where it says reserved to the Indians as their hunting ground, the very next sentence says, until our further pleasure is known. So they left the door open for further expansion. And let's see, the Sugar Act had to do with trade with some of the other nations, colonies in the Caribbean, like I mentioned before. And this was a source of hard money, hard currency. People say, well, the people in the colonies were richer than the people back home in England. Well, it's kind of true. They were land rich, but cash poor. And British government got a kind of false impression about the wealth there was in America. Because, during the French and Indian War, there were contracts being given to American firms. The British soldiers would get their pay and go into town and spend it in American businesses and things like that. And Britain subsidized the American colonies for putting troops in the field alongside of British regulars and so forth. So there was kind of like that false sense of what is actually wealth, but very little hard currency. There was a lot of paper money based on the commodity that that colony produced, such as tobacco in Virginia. And the paper money was basically an IOU, but that was dependent on what was sold in Europe based on the British Stock Exchange, how much that commodity was worth. So a £1 note of Virginia currency might not have equaled a £1 note in Great Britain. And furthermore, some of the taxes that were specified had to be paid in pounds sterling. So there's very little currency, hard currency here. There was other ways they could make currency, such as French livre or so forth, but that's you can ask that when we get to the Q&A. And the Quartering Act of 1765, that meant that Americans had to quarter British soldiers with buildings and equipment such as straw to make beds with if they didn't have beds, and candles and things like that. What's the one thing Americans and British citizens in this period absolutely hated? Anybody with regards to quartering soldiers? They hated standing armies in peacetime. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763. In 1765, there are still a lot of British troops stationed here. They created what was called the American Establishment, so they could station soldiers here. Yes, some of them were on the frontier. A lot of them were in New York. Most of them were in New York. So this Quartering Act fell mainly on New York. And of course, New York protested, and it was later repealed or amended after a while too. Then the Revenue Acts. Okay, we all know about the Stamp Act, or who knows about the Stamp Act? Let's put it that way. Yes, ma'am.
I just know it started in Hagerstown, Maryland. Frederick now.
Okay.
And England just said that every piece of paper had to have this stamp, and here are the stamps, and you have to pay for them and enjoy.
Very good. It was a means of raising revenue or taxes. The problem with it was people say, well, Americans didn't want to pay taxes. That's not true. Americans paid taxes. They paid taxes to the parish, they paid taxes to the county, they paid taxes to the colony, and depending on what it was, taxes to the king. And it was fine as long as these were passed in our lower houses of the General Assemblies, the burgesses in Virginia, if it was passed there to levy the taxes. And that's, those are called internal taxes. The Stamp Act, you've heard it said that the British did this because they had to pay down the debt of the 7 Years' War, right? Well, that's also a little bit misleading too. What they were trying to do is cut the expenses of administering the colonies and defending the colonies. So they levied the Stamp Act to raise the money. And the Americans didn't like it because this made it an internal tax. It's different from an export tax or something like that. So like you said, any legal documents had to have the stamp, had to have a revenue stamp on it. And you had to purchase that in order to conduct your business. Or it's also for business transactions as well as government businesses like court documents. They also put a tax on the paper for newspapers. Playing cards, I don't know how they figure that, but playing cards were included. So this is a way to raise the revenue to pay for this American establishment and the colonial administration. But why the Americans didn't like it? Because it bypassed their lower houses of assembly. The burgesses, according to Virginians, was the same as the House of Commons. So any taxes that were going to be paid in Virginia had to be paid according to a law passed by the burgesses. In fact, the refrain was that that British subjects could only be denied their property, including money, by their own consent or that of their elected representatives, meaning the delegates that served in the burgesses. That's why it was so hateful to Americans. It seemed to be an infringement on liberty. We already went through the salutary neglect. Well, this is creeping in on that salutary neglect, that sense of autonomy the American colonies had. The images that you see up there, the death's head, that's actually from a typeface from the Maryland Gazette, because it represented, the Stamp Act represented the death of American liberty. That's why they picked the death's head. And there was protests. Some of them got violent. There were demands that the tax agents, the ones that collected the money, resign. Some of them were hanged in effigy, like you see on there. And some of these protests got pretty out of hand. And the way the Americans fought against it was okay, we'll play by your rules. We're not going to use any we can't put a bill of lading on the ship full of tobacco sitting in the harbor because we're not going to use the stamp paper for the bill of lading. So the ship sits there full of tobacco, not being able to land because it didn't have the legal documents. Or a ship coming from Great Britain comes in with finished goods and textiles, and it has to sit in the harbor because the agent on land is not going to use a stamped paper to make the transaction to land the goods from England. So this affects Great Britain really bad, especially their labor and business people, because what's America mostly doing? Its exports to Great Britain are raw materials that British industry turns into finished goods and then ships them back, finished goods, to the colonies where it sells them and has a protected market. So the Americans are going to play their game and not use the stamp paper to conduct business, and so they get the British merchants and industry on their side, and the act is repealed within 2 years. But Parliament thinks, well, we're not going to let them push us around. They're just colonies. So they passed what was called the Declaratory Act, which says Parliament can pass laws that govern any parts of the empire to show, well, okay, you won this round, but in the future, you're not going to be able to do it. The next constitutional crisis comes up is a series of laws called the Townshend Acts. We're not going to go through them all, but the one that affects Americans the most was an import duty. Okay, this time they're going to put a tax on things that are shipped to the colonies and they said, well, the Americans said they didn't want to pay internal taxes. So this is an external tax. But what did the revenue raised by the Townshend duties do? Okay, it was a tax on paint and lead and glass and tea. And the purpose was the revenues that were collected were to pay the salaries of the royal governors, the king's appointed judges, and things like that. Well, the Americans didn't like this either. Okay, they said it was an external tax masqueraded as an internal tax, or internal tax masqueraded as an external tax. Because why? Because the only check and balance the colonies had on the royal administration was they passed the laws for the taxes that paid the governor's salary, that paid the judges, that paid the sheriffs, and things like that. So that's why the Americans didn't like the Townshend duty. So they tried the same thing. We're going to do the boycott again, or the non-importation, non-exportation agreements. It gets so bad in Boston that Boston is under military occupation. 4 regiments from New York are sent up there, and 4 more regiments from Ireland, and pretty much issue martial law to enforce the Townshend duties. But how can you enforce the Townshend duties on people that just don't want to buy something? Yeah. So that was the cause. And again, Americans, like Britons and in England, do not like standing armies in peacetime. So what happens on the 5th of March, 1770? There was a civil disturbance. We call it the Boston Massacre, where 4 colonists are killed. Interestingly enough, or ironically enough, there was opposition to the Townshend duties in Parliament as well. And Lord Dunmore in the House of Lords gets up and makes a speech that seconds the bill to repeal the Townshend duties. And Parliament does repeal them, but it's interesting that Dunmore does that, or it's repealed on the same day as the Boston Massacre, okay, which is spun out of the protest of the Townshend duties. And Lord Dunmore is later appointed the Royal Governor of New York. And when he gets to New York, he makes a speech and he says the Constitution is fixed, by which he means that the Constitution, where the bills of revenue have to start in the lower houses, and in the colonies, that means the lower house of the General Assembly. That's what he's talking about. The Constitution is fixed. Part of his speech that in favor of repeal the Townshend duties, he says the Americans if how did I put that? Americans, forgot the exact quote. The Americans would soon be quiet once the Townshend duties are repealed. And some people consider 1770 to 1773, the period between the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, as the quiet period. Oh, the Americans, if left to themselves, would soon be quiet, is the actual quote. So Britain repeals all the taxes that came under the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea. Okay, and that brings us to the next one. This is, again, another line from the Liberty Song. In freedom we're born, and freedom will live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. They are willing to pay taxes, but as long as, not as slaves, but as freemen. Not as slaves, meaning they get to keep what they produce and freely give their taxes instead of being forced. So that's what that line means from the Liberty Song. Again, does not sound like rebellion, does not sound like revolution. Like I've already been through that slide already. So the period of quiet. One thing interesting about the period of quiet, the Spanish royal governor of Buenos Aires in present-day Argentina invades the British Falkland Islands in the early 1770s. Sound familiar? Same thing? Like when Argentina invaded the Falklands in the 1780s. I only say that because I think it's interesting. But in 1773, Britain passes the Tea Act. It's another attempt to raise revenue on the Americans. And it's also a way to bail out the British East India Company that collected the tea, like in India, shipped it to Great Britain where it was taxed, then shipped it to the colonies. Also, any tea from other countries, such as France, their East India Company had to be landed in England first before it could be shipped to the colonies. And you hear a lot about smuggling. Well, it's not really that much of a cloak and dagger thing. It's just that the French merchants or American merchants that went to France just bypassed that stop to pay the taxes. But the East India Company needed to be bailed out. They had warehouses overflowing with tea and they couldn't sell it. Americans liked tea very much. So Britain thought, well, we'll change the rules a little bit where the East India Company can send their tea shipments directly to the colonies. Don't pass go, don't pay your tax in England, but they levied a tax on the tea that was going to be sold in the American colonies. Again, this takes away the authority of the lower houses of assembly, of the American General Assemblies, to pass tax bills, okay? Completely does that. Again, the money collected is going to pay for royal administration. So it's an internal tax masquerading as an import tax. Yes, the tax was minimal. In fact, people in the colonies paid less for their tea than people back in England. Problem was the British government could raise that tax at any time. Gave the East India Company a virtual monopoly on the sale of tea as well. So that's a couple of reasons why the Americans didn't like it. You've already had a talk on the Boston Tea Party, so we won't go into all the details of that. But basically, the problem with it was that the tax on the tea was put on the tea when the tea was landed, okay? So it's not like a sales tax. So it's not like you can just not buy tea in order to avoid the tax. Your agent on the ground, your merchant, had to pay the tax just to land the tea, whether you bought it or not. So in a way, they were taxing it. It could not be just boycotted. So in the other colonies, like in Philadelphia and New York, Charleston, the tea wasn't landed. Well, in Charleston, it was landed, but it was locked up in a warehouse and then sent back. But Philadelphia and New York, it was just sent back without being landed. And in Boston, we know what happened with the destruction of the tea. The destruction of the tea really irked the British government, okay? It was destruction of private property. A lot of Americans thought that too, it's destruction of private property. Great Britain said that Boston had to pay for the tea, okay? And if they paid for the tea, there'd be no other repercussions. But when Boston refused to pay for the East India Company tea, Parliament passed the coercive, or what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts, and we'll go through a couple of those. Boston Port Act, anybody ever heard of it? It closed the port of Boston on June 1st, 1774. Okay. All commerce pretty much ceased in the port of Boston at that time. There's already troops in Boston, British troops in Boston. Britain sends more troops to Boston. The Governor Hutchison, is replaced by General Gage, who is the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. So he's not only the commander-in-chief, but he's also the governor of the colony. First thing he does is dissolve the lower house of their assembly, the House of Representatives, and there are more hardline consequences will follow. Shortly after that, Parliament passes the Massachusetts Government Act. The Massachusetts Government Act changed how the colonial government would function. Okay, they could the town meetings could elect their members to be representatives in the House of Representatives, but no longer. It used to be that the House of Representatives in Massachusetts elected the people that served in their upper house, the council. But this was changed. From now on, the royal governor, General Gage, would appoint the upper house. It also changed the way the local governments functioned, such as courts, the appointment of sheriffs and judges and things like that. So I think this is the worst one of them all, because they abrogate Massachusetts royal charter that function as a royal colony, and they change it. And all the other colonies says, if the Parliament can do this to Massachusetts, they can do it to all of us. That's what brings the rest of the colonies to be sympathetic with Boston, even though they disagreed with the destruction of private property. So the other colonies are sending aid and food and things like that to get around the British blockade of Boston. The next is the Impartial Administration of Justice Act. What's one thing Americans prize about their judicial system? Trial by a jury of your peers. If there's a dispute between an American colonist and a British official, they will not be tried in a Massachusetts court, but the court will be held in Great Britain. How many of your peers are going to be found to sit in a jury in Great Britain? So that's why the Administration of Justice Act, the Americans didn't like. And then the Quebec Act. This mostly affected Virginia. Because I showed you the picture that shows what the Virginia's charter included, but part of that proclamation of 1763 set up 4 new colonies: East and West Florida, Grenada in the Caribbean, and the province of Quebec. The province of Quebec at the time didn't just include what we now know as the Canadian province of Quebec, but it also included Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. So who is going to be the ones that really don't like the Quebec Act? Virginia, okay? When all this is going on, the colonies are wondering how to respond. Massachusetts and Virginia call for a General Congress of Deputies, which we call now the First Continental Congress, which will meet in Philadelphia to come up with a unified system of resistance against all these acts. And this is what they send to the lords, the commons, and the king under different headings, and they all start a little different. They all start by proclaiming their loyalty to Great Britain and the king and everything, but basically all of them said this: to obtain redress of these grievances, okay, not rebellion, not revolution, redress of grievances, which threaten the destruction of the lives, the liberty, and property of His Majesty's subject in America. They decide on unified action. Virginia already took the lead. They passed a Virginia Association. So the Continental Congress is going to pass a resolution to have a Continental Association. It's not to go into effect right away, but they threaten Great Britain. If you don't repeal the intolerable acts, then we're going to initiate another non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption act on shipping raw materials to Great Britain or importing and selling finished products in the colonies. And even if it gets landed, we're not going to buy it. So that's basically what that says. The local committees means that in addition to the royal governments, now there are some people that will be revolutionaries in the lower houses of these general assemblies, but they also established local committees of observation to enforce this non-importation, non-exportation. Now, the militias of the several colonies come under the authority of the royal governors. They needed something to protect those committees, so they established what were called independent volunteer militia companies. Is separate from the Virginia colonial militia. And in Virginia, the six northern counties, or the northern counties, established 6 companies of these independent militia. They asked George Washington to be their field officer, meaning their colonel, and their uniform is not the red and blue that you always see pictured in the Wilson Peale portrait of Washington in his French and Indian War uniform. Their uniform was blue, faced with buff, small clothes underneath of it. That's the uniform Washington will wear as a general officer during the war. But that was based on the uniform of the independent militia from the northern counties of Virginia. Pretty much fairly soon, these committees are acting as shadow governments. In a lot of cases, when the war does start, they will assume the role of the government. Taking the lead, of course, will be Massachusetts. They passed the Suffolk Resolve, which rejects all the acts that Britain imposes on Massachusetts, especially when Governor or General Gage dissolves the lower house of assembly. They just reconstitute it in Concord, and they call it the Provincial Congress. The Provincial Congress tells the local governments, the town meetings, that continue to collect your taxes, but instead of sending them to Boston, to the royal government, send them to Concord. And the Provincial Congress in Concord starts to accumulate military equipment, supplies, tents, gunpowder, pieces of artillery, muskets, lead for shot, gunpowder, and so forth. So this is what's going to lead to April 19th, 1775, but that's getting ahead of ourselves now. Well, one of the things the Provincial Congress does is it reorganizes the Massachusetts militia. It's going to answer to the Provincial Congress. And the common militia, or what most people call the regular militia, these are organized on a county basis, and usually, unless they get an order from the governor, they can't leave their county jurisdictions. These are every able-bodied white male between the age of 16 and 60 is a member of the militia. Some will turn out to be loyalists, but that's also getting ahead of ourselves. But they also decide to create a select militia. 1/4 of the militia will be organized as Minutemen. We've all heard that term before. The Minutemen are younger, more physically fit, mostly of Whig political leanings, so they're more reliable as far as the Provincial Congress is concerned, where the common militia might drill once or twice a year. The Minutemen drill 4 times a month. Usually in the militia, you don't join the militia in the colonial period. When you turn 16, you were in the militia. But they perform their training as an act of civil obligation. The Minutemen are paid at the same rate that British regular per diem rate that British regulars are paid. So for drilling 4 or more times a month, they're getting paid for that. And it's the town meetings that raise that revenue, pass their own taxes to raise the Minutemen, pay the Minutemen, arm and organize the Minutemen, and they can also cross county boundaries, go anywhere in the colony that the provincial Congress tells them to. And they'll play a big role in April 19th when we get to that. What the provincial Congress is doing is going to create what was called an army of observation. They're going to sit and watch and see what the British do. But in case there's a shooting war, they are definitely getting ready for that. So we'll leave it off there because we're not going to go into April 19th. But what Ed was talking about, I look at the American Revolution. There's a difference between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and some others write that there's basically 2 different ideas we're talking about here. The American Revolution starts with the Stamp Act in 1765, according to them, and I agree with them, ends with the passing of the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Some people take it a little further than that, but that's mainly what these contemporaries have said. And I like this quote here. There is nothing. Benjamin Rush, who was he's in Philadelphia. He gives a speech where he says there's nothing more common than to confound the terms the American Revolution with the late American War. If you read contemporary accounts following the war, that's what they refer. The British always refer to it as the American War. American colonists turned American citizens will refer to it as the American War as well. We call it the Revolutionary War later in the course of our history. So unless you have any questions, this ends my presentation for Britannia's Glory and Wealth. Thank you.
Okay, we can take questions. I'm sure you have some. We probably learned some. But first, it is our custom and our tradition to pass the hat.
Yeah, you are in church. So.
Our Arizona collection place.
While that's going on, I'd like to make a shameless self-promotion.
Oh, yeah, please do.
I brought a couple of the books I wrote. The one on the left is about the war on the frontier. So it includes what's going on the frontier of Virginia, as well as Maryland, to a certain extent, New York and Pennsylvania. Culmination of the book is the Sullivan expedition into Iroquois country in 1779. Then the other one, Dunmore's War, is the last colonial war before the Revolutionary War starts, where Lord Dunmore calls out the colonial militia to fight the Indians in the Ohio Valley during the summer of 1774. I also have one other one that I brought called The 10 Key Campaigns of the American Revolution. I didn't pick the title. But the first chapter is mine about April 19th, about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And I call it Let It Begin Here because not only is that the start of the Revolutionary War, but that is a quote attributed to John Parker, who commanded the Lexington Militia Company on April 19th. So thank you. Sir.
Here's my question. You've been studying this for years, and like some of us, you go back to the bicentennial.
Yeah, I remember that.
And you've given us a really cogent synthesis today of these events in the years leading up to 1775. What's the biggest change that you see in how you interpret this from where you might have started, say, in the early 1970s as we were moving into bicentennial?
I think the biggest thing, and the more I learned about it, convinced me of it, is too many people thought the American Revolution was only about paying taxes, that the Americans did not want to pay taxes, which is untrue. And it was only about tea. And I think we have gotten away from that, thank goodness. Yeah, we knew about the proclamation line, but most people think, well, it meant no settlement beyond this line. But there were already thousands of people living there. So they had to convene treaties with the Iroquois in the north, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, and with the Cherokees in the south, with the treaties of Hard Labor Creek and Lock Harbor, which, although you don't read about it in many histories, essentially moved the area open to settlement to the Ohio River, as far as the Tennessee River, and which includes most of Kentucky. So we don't realize that 1763 to 1768 for the first two treaties I talked about, and 1771 for the second one with the Cherokees. So I guess that's basically it. It wasn't, the line, the war was started because Americans didn't like the proclamation line, period. Yeah, that's true, but we moved the proclamation line essentially, but we never talk about that. And it was done by the Indians themselves. It was the Six Nations. The Six Nations of Europe were an empire. All right? I know people don't like to call Indians an empire, but they considered everybody that lived along the Ohio their dependents. And they told them, you're going to have to move because we just made this treaty with our father, the King of Great Britain. We pocketed the money, but you don't have to know about that. But you have to move. The Indian tribes that lived on the south bank of the Ohio had to move to the north bank of the Ohio as far as the Iroquois were concerned. And the Cherokee, Kentucky was considered just hunting ground. It was pretty much uninhabited. But the treaties with them redefined where they thought their influence ended. And the second one ended on easily recognizable terrain. It wasn't just giving up more land. Just the first one was just an arbitrary line on a map. The second one, Treaty of Lock Harbor, followed terrain features that anybody walking in the woods could understand where the line was. So that's basically, is that too much?
No, that's all. So we should be looking in that direction.
Yeah.
As we all begin our manner studies going into the semi-coincident.
Yes, yeah. I love saying that, semi-quincentennial. Sir.
The phrase taxation without representation, do they really need representation in the British Parliament, or their colonial lower houses being more active in taxes?
Excellent question. In fact, it was first said by somebody in Parliament, taxation without representation. The last thing the colonists wanted was representation in Parliament. How many delegates would they have gotten to sit in the Commons? 4, 5, maybe? How many were sitting in Commons at the time? 200 something? Yeah, they're not going to go. It is exactly what you said. They're talking about their lower houses of assembly, which they considered the equivalent of House of Commons, and their colonial councils were the equivalent of the House of Lords. And the colonial governor sat in the room. He was the viceroy of the king. Okay, so they called their colonies my country. It's not till the war starts that Americans start thinking of America as the country. It's Virginia is my country. Pennsylvania is my country. But yes, you're correct. They are looking at the lower houses of assembly as where the authority to tax resides. Sir.
Question for you. It might be a little controversial, so if you want to beg out, I appreciate that. But that is very strong. In this period, we've got the militias who are putting together the Commonwealth militia, and shortly after this, we fall to the time of Reagan's Constitution and putting together the governments. Today, we have a second amendment. There's reference to militia interpretation.
Militia. The question was, and tell me if I get this right, is establishment of the militia in the Constitution as it relates to the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Is that pretty much in a nutshell? Well, the militia, as I mentioned before, is not an organized body writ large. Okay? The militia is every able-bodied male citizen is a member of the militia. And that's even when they passed they passed a militia law in 1791, they passed another one in 1903, I think it is, and they passed another one in 1917, okay? Every adult, able-bodied male citizen is a member of the militia. So we have the organized militia and the unorganized militia. It says unorganized militia is everybody. So they have the right to bear arms because they have to. They have to be a member of the militia. The writ large part, I draw your attention to the American Civil War, whereas the U.S. volunteers that are raised for the Union Army are done under the authority of the state's adjutants general. They call for volunteers, they form them and their first militia. Once then, when they're ready, they are inspected by a regular Army officer in a special muster. The term passing muster comes from this. If they pass muster, they're taken into the Union Army as U.S. volunteers. In World War I, 1917, Congress passes the Selective Service Act based on the militia laws. Every able-bodied male citizen is a member of the militia, and that gives the federal government the authority to conscript people out of the common militia into either National Guard and then into the Army, or directly into the Army. So does that answer your question?
Well, I follow. What precisely does the term well-regulated militia mean?
That they be able to operate their firearms, for one, that they, when I give my talks on Dunmore's War, I like to liken the colonial militias not so much as the modern National Guard, like a lot of people say. No, it is more like selective service, because they have to have some rudimentary knowledge of the military and firearms, and it's a body of able-bodied men available for military service, not necessarily in military service, but available for military service. And when the National Rifle Association is formed, it's with that in mind, following the Civil War. Does that answer your questions? I hope. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it also true that the armed services issuing uniforms and weaponry is fairly recent? As in, the colonial soldiers weren't issued uniforms or rifles.
Well, did everybody hear a question? Okay. Let me see if I get this right. Isn't it fairly recent that the government issues militia uniforms and weapons to become the militia? Is that correct?
So before then, they have to bring their own.
They have to, the question was before the Constitution, or before the Constitution, they have to bring their own weapons, okay? But if you read the militia laws, yes, they bring their own weapons, and this ties into the reason for the Second Amendment, is they had to know how to use them. So every able-bodied white male citizen in Virginia in 1774 had to have a firelock. It could either be a musket or a fowling piece, or if you lived on the frontier, you could substitute a rifle. Every able-bodied white male citizen had to have a cartridge box, and you could substitute a powder horn and a shot pouch. Everybody in the militia had to have a bayonet. How many times have you heard, well, the Americans didn't know how to use a bayonet? They had to have one, okay? They did more than just skewer their chicken on it. And if you didn't have a bayonet, or if you were armed with a rifle, because a rifle couldn't take a bayonet, then you could substitute a tomahawk. They had to have their own weapons. They also had to keep their ammunition. They had to keep 10 pounds of lead and 3 pounds of powder at their homes. And they had to come to every militia muster with 3 rounds, regardless of what kind of weapon they had. And if they were called into what they called then actual service, meaning if the militia was going to go off and actually fight somewhere, they would not just take the whole company would just not march away. They would muster the company and say, okay, we need 10 volunteers from this town to go join a militia expedition. And if they couldn't get 10 volunteers, then they drafted the people they couldn't get volunteers from. Well, in Virginia, they would be armed with the muskets that are kept at the magazine in Williamsburg, the King's Arms, and from ammunition stored at the magazine. Yes, they use their own personal weapons for training and for local emergencies, but if there was a exercise national emergency, national meaning Virginia, then they'd be issued a weapon from the magazine. Does that answer your question?
And uniforms?
Uniforms, some militia bought their own uniforms. Generally, they wore what were called citizens' clothes, but some militia, particularly what were called select militia, bought their own uniforms according to some kind of regulation. If you read my book on Dunmore's War, Captain William Russell down in Fincastle County contracted with a clothier to provide his men with linen hunting coats and essentially a uniform. And for one, it was one way to attract men when he had to recruit men for his company out of the militia. Two, it was a uniform. It's plain and simple. Does that answer your question?
Later on in the war, and I know I've looked at Anthony Wayne toward the end of the war, they were requesting, demanding uniforms to be issued by the government,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not the hunting shirts anymore.
The regimentals.
So that changed over time?
Yeah. Everybody hear the question? Okay. Let's see if I get this right. Anthony Wayne, what, about 1777 would have been?
I'm talking about 81.
1781.
They want
By then, the hunting shirts are gone. Yeah. The question was about hunting shirts versus the regimentals, the regimental uniform that you're familiar with seeing, blue faced with red or whatever color. The hunting shirts only stay in the rifle units, and we like to think that, well, all the Americans carried rifles and hid behind trees and stuff like. Wrong. The riflemen never were more than 10% of the Continental Army at any one time, and they wore hunting shirts for most of the war, or I'd say all the war. Washington issues an order in 1776 for all American infantrymen to wear the hunting shirt. Little psychological warfare. Make the Brits think that we're all riflemen. Okay, that turns out not to be true. The Congress passes some colonies prescribed a uniform for the people that joined the Continental Army from their colonies or states. In 1777, I think it's the year that the Continental Congress passes a resolution about what the uniform should look like. But since we didn't have very much money, and Continental Congress doesn't have the authority to tax, so they have to rely on the states to voluntarily do all this. You really didn't see very many uniforms. And you see a lot of pictures of American Continental soldiers wearing brown. Well, those are captured redcoats in a lot of cases that they dyed to make look brown. Or they used what was locally available. It's not until 1780, 1781 where the new regulation comes out where New England soldiers wear blue faced with white. The New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania soldiers wear blue faced with buff. Maryland, Virginia soldiers wear blue faced with red. And the Carolinas and Georgia were blue faced with light blue. So that's the really defining uniform regulation we get. And who's going to pay for it? Okay, Congress says, well, the states have to pay for it, and the states said, no, you have to pay for it. And we know you don't have any money except for what comes through tariffs from overseas. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Good. I just made it up. Any other questions, sir?
Yeah. We hear a lot about right wing precursor to the revolution.
Yeah.
But also in the 18th century, the Hanoverians were a new dynasty,
Mm-hmm.
and they had down rebellion in Scotland.
Two.
And the whole concept of the United Kingdom.
The United Kingdom doesn't show up as an entity until much later.
How those divisions, and in fact, you have a new dynasty, which is a foreign dynasty. How did that play in the first period?
Well, did everybody hear the question about the Hanoverian dynasty? It plays into it in a number of ways, not the least of which is religion. So you have people that are Roman Catholics or Jews or the dissenting churches they are taxed When I mentioned earlier that they were used to paying taxes at the parish level, well, the sheriff came around and collected money from everybody in the limits of the parish and went to support the local Anglican parish, regardless of which way you practiced. So that plays into it. The Hanoverians usurped, if you could use that term, the Stuarts. Again, the Stuarts are primarily Catholic, not all, but primarily Catholic, so there's a division there. Great Britain, the term Great Britain only includes England and Scotland, Wales being included in England. And that's one of the things the Americans point to, is that our countries, our colonies, or if you lump them all together as the American colonies, should be treated the same way as you treat Ireland. They have their own parliament, their own governor general, yes, answerable to the king, but still they collect their own taxes, and they pass their own laws, not subject to the laws of parliament. So the Americans say, hey, treat us like you do Ireland right now, you know, so it plays into that too. Does that kind of answer your question about some of the divisions? There are others, but we're probably out of time, but and I'll probably think of some more as I'm driving home. Should have said that. Okay, you?
Yeah, I was fascinated by, you're saying that it wasn't called the Revolutionary War at the time, it was called the American. When did the term Revolutionary War?
I don't know.
vote?
I don't know. You did. I have to turn in my PhD.
But you don't find at the time nobody uses that term?
They use the term revolution occasionally. They more often use the War of Independence. It's the British that mainly use American War, and like Benjamin Rush did, I would think they are more talking about our independence rather than our revolution.
Which I know to this day, calling it
American
rather
War.
than Revolutionary War.
Yeah, yeah. And they consider it a civil war. Is that it? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.